Right, I shall start again now that I'm unmuted. The Scottish Episcopal Institute is the Anglican agency north of the border, tasked with preparing candidates for authorised ministry within that tradition. And I begin with that statement because context is all important in this discussion. SEI is a community of faith and learning that forms candidates for a variety of ministries, lay and ordained. Those who study within its virtual walls do so because both they and the denomination have discerned a potential vocation to serve Christ's church. The criteria for selection focus primarily on issues of faith, belief, and calling. Discernment continues throughout the next 3 years of a candidate's formation to see whether that recommendation for training should end up as a recommendation for licensing as a reader or ordination to the diaconate. Now, if starting with that statement makes you think I'm going to be describing a solely Athens-based curriculum as opposed to a Berlin approach, that's not the case. SEI, with its goal of preparing committed Christians for the role of public ministry and mission, operates a hybrid model and seeks to encourage a vibrant dialectic between those two understandings of what theological education is all about. And that can be most clearly seen from the second statement I wish to make. SEI's curriculum is validated by two agencies, the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England and Durham University. Those two very different entities joined together in 2013 in a historic partnership to provide a suite of higher education awards for ordinands and others studying in colleges and courses across the UK. In other words, a partnership was formed between church and academy. And that is crucial. While a recent article in Practical Theology stated that the university theology faculty and the training seminary are trying for the most part to do quite different things, nevertheless, the 19 theological education institutions, of which SEI is one, are attempting to tread a pathway that is the fruit of the union of these so-called opposites. The aim of this pathway is the development of theological understanding, that is, aptitude for wisdom and theological reflection pertaining to responsible life in faith. The entire task of the Institute is thus theological, in the original sense of theology as the wisdom proper to the life of the believer. Theology then serves as the goal, the glue, and the reference point of the whole enterprise, and theological formation as its central defining task. Those who study and those who teach in this community of practice are engaged in a continuous process of transformation, or as Rowan Williams put it, a steady and endless enlarging of the heart through union in prayer with the Word, which is also a steady and endless growth in knowledge of the Father. Such students are not disinterested learners studying theology as a second language, but committed disciples, people with a sapiential approach to the study of theology, people who wish to appropriate it personally. The curriculum thus seeks to form persons with the habitus that enables them to serve as agents of God's mission in today's world. It does this by providing an education in theology, mission, and ministry, which encourages the development of character and the nurturing of virtues and spirituality, alongside the acquisition of knowledge and understanding and the development of cognitive and practical skills. The programme aims to enable students to engage more deeply with themselves, with others, the church, the world, and God by offering learning that forms them in various disciplines, is constantly oriented towards the mission and ministry for which they're being prepared, and enables students to develop as lifelong reflective learners. These goals and the processes and practices leading to their attainment are intimately interwoven, situated as they are in a communal life of prayer and worship, which continuously draws all members of the community, staff and students alike, back to the source and purpose of all theological learning, knowledge and love of God. Faculty within such a community of practice are not simply teachers, but also fellow disciples, and as such, lifelong learners. A criterion of excellence is thus their ability to keep doing their theology in a way that is explicitly rooted in the practice of living the faith, and to act as mentors and guides in so doing. People whose operant theology is seen to be in line at all times and in all places with their espoused theology. Martin Percy puts it beautifully when he describes the character of a non-residential course such as SEI's as a community of fellow learners on the viaticum. And he continues, thus, how we teach ordinands to hold complex issues, the character that teachers and mentors exhibit under pressure, and how individuals continue to embody being the very best kind of reflective practitioners, these are the skills that often make their deep mark in the formation process. SEI rejoices in being of such a size, on average about 20 candidates across 3-year groups, whereby it's possible for faculty to know each student individually and to be able to pay close and direct attention to all aspects of their personal appropriation of wisdom about God. Teachers, after all, are doing no less in their own lives. Faculty, however, have to have other capacities, not least in the manner of their teaching. There is no high entry academic tariff into SEI, though as it happens, a majority of our students enter with higher degrees in theology or in other subjects. However, many do not, and so teachers need to develop skill in teaching across mixed ability groups and very wide age ranges, and thus very different worldviews. They need skills too in teaching across disciplines, smudging the lines now conventionally imposed by disciplinary differences without any loss of critical rigour. Such interrelatedness is actively encouraged by the very architecture of the Common Awards suite of degrees and awards. Interdisciplinary approaches permeate the curriculum, thwarting the fragmentation of learning into discrete disciplines, and encouraging learners to think critically and theologically across subject areas. Common Awards then adheres to an understanding of Christian education that is holistic, shaping intellect, spirit, affections, relationships, and bodily life. It is about formation, the gradual transformation of learners, with the cooperation of the grace of God, into the likeness of Christ, and into ways of being, knowing, and doing that are kingdom-shaped, reflecting the calling for which learners are being shaped. As one writer put it, it crunches souls and moves hearts as much as it informs minds. It makes Christian character and Christian spirituality central rather than co-curricular. It seeks to develop people steeped in Christian wisdom, that deep disposition of the heart and mind that knows how to act and speak in a distinctively Christian manner. Wisdom implies the ability to make wise choices in the midst of life's contingent circumstances, where there are no easy answers or ready blueprints to hand, and don't we know that at the moment? Theologically informed reflective practice is thus the operative paradigm for the entire curriculum. Methods of interweaving theology with experience, text with context, are taught throughout the 3 years until these become habits of the heart. But theological reflection is only as good as the theology, and here I use the term in its more modern form of discrete disciplines. It's only as good as the theology that goes into the process of reflection. And that is why, as I said at the outset of this discussion paper, that SEI operates a hybrid model, appropriating from the Berlin model an openness to the scholarly disciplines of critical inquiry and rigorous research. Students tackle an intense 3-year syllabus comprising biblical studies, the Christian tradition, i.e. doctrine, history, ethics, and the theology and practice of ministry and mission. Language about faith, honed across the ages, is thus learned in as much depth as is appropriate based on the prior educational experience of each student. We encourage everyone to study to the highest possible level, enabling them to speak the language of faith in contemporary society. For theology, understood in this way as objective knowledge, is the grammar needed if students are to conjugate the human scene in an intelligent way today. Accordingly, SEI has to fulfill the requirements of current higher education infrastructure and quality assurance processes assiduously, very assiduously. It needs also to demonstrate compliance with the quality assurance criteria relating to the provision of adequate learning environments. Such criteria include suitable library accommodation, appropriately qualified staff, and clarity about expectations for the successful completion of programs of study. SEI recently petitioned to be allowed to teach to master's level, as we believe that students need to continue to be fed theologically even after they have finished their initial ministerial formation and move into curacies and beyond. We seek also to encourage ongoing theological engagement in a number of ways, by setting up opportunities for candidates to publish papers in the SEI journal, this being for some the very first time they've been encouraged to dip their toes into the world of peer-reviewed writing. By teaching them how to write book reviews to publication standard in their 3rd year of reflective practice classes, by re-establishing close links with the 4 ancient Scottish universities, partly through the setting up of an annual lecture hosted by those various schools of divinity, and by sponsoring opportunities for those who wish to spend time in other educational institutions across the world to do so, or to take electives closer to home in subjects currently not on SEI's curriculum. And we do this because we believe that the Church needs leaders who are highly educated in the disciplines of theology. Clergy are, after all, as diligent ministers of the Word of God, called to teach the Christian faith and devote themselves to all studies that will increase their faith and deepen their understanding of the truth, words from our ordinal. They have to do those things. Therefore, they must be equipped to think at the highest level about the nature of faith and its relationship to other disciplines, and to speak the language of reason, to be people who are capable of sustaining an intelligent apologetic, both in the secular public square and from the pulpit. People who can articulate afresh for new generations what the Christian vision is about in terms that are contextually intelligible and involve a non-defensive search for truth. We need clergy who are adept at adult Christian theological education, developing the lives of the disciples in their congregations in new and rigorous ways, giving them a faith worth thinking about and a faith to think with. Thus, one of SEI's aims is indeed academic excellence in the disciplines of theology, but not simply excellence for its own sake. Rather, the challenge is to look beyond matters of achieving academic status to excellence as such in body, mind, and spirit. Theology is indeed the grammar of a thinking faith, to paraphrase Wittgenstein. SEI strives to instantiate that grammar in the lives of its candidates, that by so absorbing it, so appropriating it, they may live ever more godly lives. Such an integrative process is a difficult balancing act, but it is essential. As Bishop Graham Tomlin says so succinctly in this paragraph with which I close. Theological training designed to cultivate Christian wisdom will need to combine the best of the academy within the life of the Church. It will need to take theological study with the utmost academic seriousness, yet never divorced from the life and worship of the Church, both local and universal. Otherwise, on the one hand, whatever wisdom is gained risks not being truly and deeply Christian. On the other, what is learned may be increased knowledge, information, or academic understanding, but not true wisdom. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom, and in all thy getting, get understanding.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. A splendid start to the evening. And so could I now hand over to Professor Spurlock from the University of Glasgow.
Thanks, David. So first of all, I will try not to lower the tone after that really excellent exposition of theological education within the Scottish Episcopal Church. And I would also like to herald the Scottish Episcopal Church for its proactive formation of theological training and really being intentional about how they do that. What I'll talk to you about today is a bit of my own experience, what we're doing at the University of Glasgow and the sort of wider landscape of theological education. And I should make the disclaimer right away that my opinions are my own. They do not represent my institution, nor the denominational affiliations that I hold. But I should also probably give you a little bit of a snapshot of that trajectory. So I'm a member of the Church of Scotland and the United Reformed Church. My previous ecclesiastical participation when I lived in the Republic of Ireland was the PCI. When I crossed the border into Ulster, I could no longer feel quite as comfortable holding that ecclesiastical affiliation, and I returned to some of my American roots, which was participation in Quaker worship in a very traditional, unprogrammed way. So I am an ecclesiastical mutt, but I'm deeply interested in the relationship between theological education in universities and churches. And so I guess really just to give you highlights of where this is going to go, I mean, first of all, I'd like to reflect briefly on what or where theology is in universities. I'd like to raise a slightly more provocative question about where theology is in churches. And thirdly, I'd like to make a plead for the necessity of, I think, a fallow relationship between higher education and a number of institutional churches, the need for that relationship that has sort of gone to seed to be revitalized. So much of what I'll be saying is not necessarily directly bearing on the SEI, but some of the things I say might resonate and lead to further conversations. I should also say, just finally, that I do have other horses in this race, and that is, besides being a member of staff at Glasgow, I'm also a tutor at the Scottish College, formerly known as the Scottish United Reformed and Congregational College. But it gives me great pleasure that I can in some way contribute to both denominations that I'm a member of in a professional capacity. So where is theology in universities? The sad fact is that it's waning. The number of faculties and the number of staff within those faculties is decreasing. The ancient, older universities are the places where this remains a strong academic discipline, as well as some other smaller institutions that have particular denominational affiliation. But even from the Episcopal Church's perspective, I think Anne said there are 17 institutions. That's slightly less than there would have been in the past in terms of the rejigging of relationships, and it becomes unsustainable for some smaller colleges to continue. But from our own perspective, and colleagues would agree with this, I think, theology is in the DNA of our faculty at Glasgow. The reason that the University of Glasgow was established was to train Catholic clergy from 1451, and then after the Reformation to train Protestant clergy, although there were a few decades in there where there wasn't quite such a clear distinction between the Protestants and Catholics that were training within our institution. And although we are driven by institutional priorities, and often that's a difficulty, actually, some of the recent changes across higher education have been really beneficial for us in how we explain what we do in relation to churches. So first and foremost, the introduction of fees has meant that universities take teaching much more seriously than they had in the past. And there's also an increased emphasis on how we relate to not just our student body, but the wider community. And in terms of research, there's an emphasis that what research we do should have impact and public engagement. So actually, there's a line within the university policies, which I am able to carve out a bit more space to justify our purpose in being outward looking towards churches and that participation. So that's just a little bit of a background about theology in university institutions. We have one master and we have one friend. The master is the bureaucratic administration that needs to see the financial buoyancy of a department, but we would want to actively seek to work alongside churches for the development of those institutions. Now, I think in some sense, the question of where theology in universities is a little less problematic than the question of where theology is in churches. Not speaking for the SCI, and in fact, the Scottish Episcopal Church is in a slightly different situation, since that foundation of communion is rooted in liturgy and tradition in a way that's not quite as confessional or restrictive. The Church of Scotland, on the other hand, by definition, is a confessional church. In 1690, when it was reestablished as a Presbyterian church, it established itself on the confessional grounds of the Westminster Confession for all of the difficulties of that. And in 1921, when they were working towards reunification of the majority of the Free Church and the Church of Scotland in 1929, the Acts Declaratory basically state that the Westminster Confession is the unbreakable line that churches must adhere to or risk losing their property. Okay, so that's slightly problematic in a church where actually a lot of the discourse that takes place is completely unrelated to or detached from that Westminster Confession. That's in part because it's a very dated historical document. It holds things in it that are slightly difficult for some people, including the idea of double predestination and some other doctrines. And I think what that's led to in the Church of Scotland, for instance, is a lot of religious discourse in the General Assembly and in other courts, but it's not necessarily theological. This has been raised by a petition that had come from the Presbytery of Peebles that had raised the question about whether the Westminster Confession should still be the subordinate standard of the Church of Scotland, which opened up a discussion in the Church of Scotland's Theological Forum, which I had the pleasure of sitting on for a couple of years, to think about how do you deal with the thorny issue of a 17th century confession of faith, which doesn't necessarily align with what people believe or hold on a day-to-day basis. That creates some problems. So one of the responses was to introduce potentially a book of confessions, which broadens out the theological landscape in terms of discourse. But if you are a confessional church and you don't feel comfortable using the confessional standards that you say are the norm, it creates, I think, a space in which theological discourse is not inherently theological, it's religious. So and if you want to take that a step further, since I can draw on multiple denominations, you can see this particularly a phenomenon that has come to dominate Quakerism. So the Quakers have a very strong identity in terms of action, in terms of involvement, in terms of changing the world that we inhabit, but it's very untheological in its foundation. About 6 years ago, the World Meeting took place in Kenya, and for many Quakers who attended from Britain and North America, they were blown away that meetings would start with Bible studies. So there is a sense in which a church can lose that theological foundation if theology is not the language, the discourse that drives that conversation. So what I would want to say in that respect then is I think universities have a possibility for engaging with denominations in a collaborative and participatory way, to think about how we can contribute towards the theological education of denominations who, in some sense, find themselves struggling to come to terms with theological language and concepts itself. Now, the question is, where does that lie? The Church of Scotland is going through a process of reshaping its quote-unquote initial ministerial education. But where the breakdown, I think, has been in recent years is a real lack of communication between higher education institutions and the church in terms of addressing the needs of the church. So, and this is not to go on a kind of rant of personal opinion, but they've ended up with a tendering process where they've asked institutions to put forward what they think theological training should look like for that institution, and the cost, and then they will make a decision eventually when they can actually begin the tender process, rather than initiating a conversation with universities that says, what do ministers need to be prepared to minister in increasingly difficult circumstances? I think anyone who's in church leadership will probably resonate with the idea that there's not necessarily a full functioning vestry with the full professional expertise, or there's not a Kirk session with the full professional expertise that there would have been in the past to help function these things. So ministerial training is no doubt more complicated now, I think, than it has ever been. Now, I think that always needs to be done in partnership, and what Anne has described is a really robust theological training that is interested both in intellectual and academic excellence and preparation, as well as spiritual formation and the growing life of the Christian. I wouldn't dare to say that it's the university's responsibility to foster on its own the spiritual life of students. I think it's the university's responsibility to facilitate spaces for all faiths to develop among students, but it shouldn't happen independent from denominations. But I think there's a real need in terms of theological education to move beyond this idea that what is needed in terms of theological teaching is the formation of ministers. So what we're doing at Glasgow, well, I'll come to that in a minute, what we're doing at Glasgow, but we take the approach, we've reduced the number of courses where ministry candidates are taught on their own, in their own cohorts. Instead, they're taught within the wider student body. And this is beneficial for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's fair to say, even among students who are reasonably well prepared coming in for ministerial training, that the breadth of theological knowledge is not always any more robust or broad than our students who are coming in to study theology who are not training for ministry. So actually, there's a real need in terms of an increasingly secularized Scotland for Christian theology to include a real engagement with the basics, because the theological literacy is not necessarily what it would have been in previous generations. And so I think it's actually really beneficial for that bricks and mortar engagement with church history, systematic theology, practical theology. There's a real need to ensure that the practical is embedded in all of those disciplines, and this is something that we've fed back through to the Church of Scotland in terms of their preparation. But I think that we also then need to prepare people for the application, the contextualizing of those concepts in the modern world, which is not always an easy thing to do, but that's as true, I think, for non-ordinand students as it is for non-Christian students. And actually, it's really beneficial in those contexts for students who are training for ministry to be thinking through theological questions alongside the kinds of people that they would hope to be ministering to one day. That is, people who are not within a church context or church background, but that through missional activity, one in the future might be engaging with. So this idea of learning theology alongside people who are asking the questions that will be faced by people who are in ministry. So I just want to emphasize again, I think what Anne has said is spot on. But I would also want to say that I think that the need going forward is not about less content by any means than theological education, that there's a need for a great deal of content. But I think SCI has also recognized that this and other denominations are working towards this. The URC is definitely doing this. And the idea of training for a life of ministry being squeezed into 3 or 4 years is really unsustainable, and it's also really unfair. That actually what we need to be thinking about is continuing professional development beyond the initial degree, and for teaching theologically infused but very practical elements as well, so that denominations are, and whether they do this on their own or whether they partner with universities to do this, that they are continuing to develop and instill in ministers the skills that will give them the resilience they need dealing with the various challenges of ministry. But just to take a step back, then I'd want to say that what we're doing at Glasgow is looking at how we can provide theological education, and I'm saying this tongue in cheek, from cradle to grave. And that is that actually theological education with university input, I think, needs to begin not at initial ministerial education, but that we should be actively facilitating opportunities for theological education for people who have no intention to ever become ministers, people who are the bums in the seats, people who may be exploring the possibility of future Christian ministry in an ordained capacity, or even lay people who want to have a greater depth of faith. And just to go back to the Quaker analogy, I think one of the challenges within Quakerism is that historically individuals put a great deal of effort into self-learning, self-study, reading scripture. I gave a paper to a group of Irish Quakers a few years ago explaining how it's not really worth looking for the biblical quotes in George Fox's discourse, because George Fox was so instilled with scripture that every sentence that he uttered was a splicing of different biblical narratives. I mean, his language was biblical. But that in some sense has been lost in Quakerism, because the participants within worship have not necessarily been fostered and supported in putting in that prior education. And when we see ourselves in a situation where people are not going through Sunday school and being imbibed with fundamentals of Christianity in their youth in the way that they had, there's an even greater need for theological education. So how can we do this? Well, we know at Glasgow that we can't do everything ourselves, and we don't want to do everything ourselves. We want to be active partners with churches and with other organizations where we can support and work together. So just a couple of examples. We've partnered with the Presbytery of Glasgow to provide what used to be called open access courses, but short courses. And the first iteration of these is currently underway. And these courses are theological, but they are not sort of traditional cookie cutter type courses. So the first of these that's running at the moment is Reimagining Christian Practice in an Age of Uncertainty. And we're bringing in people with external expertise like John and Oliver Drain, who are delivering that course for us. We have a course that's a little bit more specifically to cater to the needs of the Presbytery of Glasgow, and that's Designing and Leading Christian Worship. We're partnering also in that with Joe Love of the Iona Community to bring them in and their expertise. And we also have a course on the books at the moment that's running called Managing Difficult Change, and that's specifically looking at change management as developed within corporate contexts, but how you can take those skills and apply them to congregational and denominational challenges. We've also developed additional continuing ministerial development master's level teaching. So through partnership with Dr. Williams Trust in London, we've managed to free up money to provide a course in an MTH in ministry, theology, and practice. And again, this was in discourse particularly with colleagues in the URC in England, thinking about what is it that a minister who's been in active service in a church for perhaps decades, what skills might enhance their ability on a week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis to reinvigorate their ministry. So we have a course on creative ministry that's being delivered by Doug Gay and Heather Walton. We have a course on resourcing congregational ministry, which Charlotte Methuen is applying some of her MBA skills to thinking through how can you look at a congregation and get the most out of what's there. We have a course that is really traditional in its nomenclature, and that is homiletics and hermeneutics, but it's all about dealing with contemporary political theology and political issues to equip people to feel like they can preach to the moment. And the last course in that master's is a theology and freedom of inquiry. So thinking about how do we, yes, orthodoxy is important, but how do we encourage people to think theologically, particularly in challenging and difficult circumstances? We're also partnering externally with Stellenbosch University, and we've managed to secure about 300,000 euros from the EU to do intentional exchanges, and this will be including a number of ministerial candidates, to be able to experience that intercultural space of church in another culture. And we're also actively partnering with the Archdiocese of Glasgow for us to be able to provide more Catholic theology courses. I think it's really important within the context of the west of Scotland that the largest demographic of Christians is the Catholic Church. And actually, apart from catechetical training, there's very little opportunity for further theological development and education for lay people. It's just not something I think that the Catholic Church and the Archdiocese has felt like they could facilitate in the current demands on clergy. And so we're looking at adding an additional rota of 4 Catholic theology courses, which will probably have a short courses iteration as well, but ensure that we're providing a theological spectrum that is reflective of the communities that we inhabit. So, and that's just on the Christian side of things. So please don't, this is not about a plug for the University of Glasgow, but it's more, I think, a plea from a university to individuals who are active and engaged members in churches to think about how churches might benefit from engagement with universities. I think in the past, part of the challenge has been universities not being church focused, but I also think that there are a number of instances that could be cataloged in recent years where churches have not necessarily looked to universities as well, even as a resource or as a partner that wants to actively contribute. So I really thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about why theology matters both in university and in churches. I'm not trying to be provocative, although I'm sure something I said maybe, but I thank you for this opportunity. And I would just also reiterate, I think Church and Academy as a platform is a wonderful thing. I think it's fantastic that this is actively facilitated, and I think it demonstrates a bright future for the Scottish Episcopal Church that some other denominations are really missing out on, thinking about how the intellectual and theological life of the church can continue to be fostered by active members. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. Before we open up to a more general discussion, Anne, is there anything you'd like to respond to, or more specifically between the two of you before we have a general discussion?
I just wondered if I could ask Scott what the catalyst was for this new church-focused attitude and stance on the part of your own university. I mean, what do you think would be the principal drivers chronologically for that?
Yeah. So what I would say is there are always a multitude of forces. I was lecturing to students today about intersectionality, and we're really fortunate at Glasgow that we have a number of members of staff who are not just members of churches, but that are actively church focused, and that want and see as part of our vocation that need for theology to be directed towards the church. In terms of the university, we've been able to open some doors by framing it in the language that is attractive to them, and that is engagement, that is impact, that is widening participation, that is internationalization in terms of our partnership with Stellenbosch. We've also established a partnership with the theology department in Lund to allow for exchanges of students without fees in the face of Brexit looming on the doorstep, because we want our students to have a broader theological education than just what they get in their own patch. So, but the university wants students to go abroad. So, in some sense, these things have been initiated in the last couple of years out of personal volition among members of staff, but always couched in the language that the university nods along to. In terms of the Iona community, we're planning to sign a formal memorandum of agreement with them soon, because it's an obvious partnership that we should have formalized years ago. But what this will allow is students to do placement-based dissertations. They could shadow an activist. They could work on the island for the summer and write a theological reflection on the theology of hospitality. They could look at community work in parts of Glasgow. They could think about Fastlane, and so, you know, in essence, it's about taking theology. Yes, theology has to be a rigorous academic discipline within a university, but if it's not applied and it's not engaged and it's not world changing, I mean, again, Glasgow uses the tagline, "We're a world changing institution." It makes all of us cringe. You know, it says "World changers welcome," but actually, if you take a step back from that shivering first response, absolutely what we want is for our students to want to make a difference when they come out the other side. And working with a community like the Iona community that has such a rich base of expertise and such a phenomenal track record of taking faith and putting it into practice, for us it's a fantastic partnership and allows us to do things that we otherwise just could not do.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to open up the discussion. Do remember to unmute yourself. You can either put something on the chat facility, or you could, if people can wave their hands, I'll try and keep my eye open. But who's got any questions to either Anne or Scott or Sister Alison first?
I have one for you, Scott, and I don't wish to be contentious, but I've enjoyed the courses that I've done during first year, but some of them were very much biased towards Church of Scotland, and I felt I didn't fit because I'm Episcopalian. Is that going to change now that you're looking at diversifying into other churches?
So first of all, I'd want to be, thank you very much. And I really appreciate that, Sister Allison. First of all, I hope it's not sounding like that we want to diversify into other churches. I think we want to broaden our theological and ecclesiastical engagement. One of the things historically is that by 1929 Act of Parliament, we are statutorily obliged to deliver ministerial training for the Church of Scotland.
Oh.
And so one of the reasons I think that it's been so Church of Scotland focused is that a lot of the initial conversations in recent years have been framed around how do we fulfill that statutory obligation. Now, and hopefully we're broadening that out, but again, things don't change overnight. In terms of being specifically focused towards the Scottish Episcopal Church, and I hope that we are facilitating theological educational encounters that enrich members of the Scottish Episcopal Church. But the Scottish Episcopal Church also has its own robust training scheme, and I know that SEI does things beyond just the training of ordinance, as Anna said. I think where we have to be much more intentional is in our engagement with the Catholic Church, because I think what Sister Allison is saying about the Church of Scotland focus, which has created that sense for her. Imagine how Catholic students in the past may have felt even before they crossed the threshold of number 4. I know that for a number of people, there has been the kind of discussion, theology and religious studies at Glasgow, the Church of Scotland faculty. Well, we don't want to be that purely, but there's also the pragmatic necessity that we need to ensure that students are coming through the door in order for the university to allow theology to continue to function. And so we do need to make sure, as long as the Church of Scotland wants to continue to use this statutory relationship, that Church of Scotland students will come. So, John McNeil Scott, who's in this call, might want to come into this as well. And I don't want to dominate all this conversation, but we very much want to actively work with the URC. And we would like to create flexible learning opportunities so that students can make sure that they are doing all of the URC training and placements that they need to do. In the past, we facilitated that by having all of our courses on a Tuesday at the first year and the second year, which is very resource heavy. And just became impossible to negotiate with the university, because English literature in their first year has 500 students in one class, and we were having between 4 and 6. And so, there is this need to balance the practicalities of administrative demands with what we can do in terms of individual partners. So it's a work in progress, Sister Allison, and that was a very long answer to a very good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa Curtis has got a question. I just want to, before Lisa, I put you on, and I would like to ask you, given the small numbers that you work with, how you feel about being more ecumenical, and wouldn't this be more kind of, what would be the losses and gains from your perspective of having a more ecumenical training, and saying, well, we've only got a few, relatively few number of students, we should throw our lot in with other churches and do all things together.
Oh, we're delighted to already be ecumenical in the sense of having wonderful URC students in our midst. And of course, the doors are always open anyway to the other partner in the EMU conversations, which is the Methodist Church, who currently have taken their training south of the border, but perhaps will reconsider that in due course. So on those three fronts, on those ways, we're definitely already ecumenical. We're doing some sharing of staff teaching with friends up on the Mount in New College. So that's an economy of scale, because it's silly to teach two courses very similarly in a place that's only a mile away. So yes, the whole time we're looking for partnerships, we're looking for opportunities to be more ecumenical, but as Scott said, we've also got a task to form people for a particular tradition, which we've also got to fulfill at the same time. So our whole paradigm is of continuing to think about new ways of being the whole time, and to see who we might partner with and walk alongside with. So I'm not saying no, never. There are opportunities ahead, I'm sure, especially in a changing Scotland at these times.
Yeah, Scott, very, very briefly, Scott.
Yeah, I'll just come in quickly. I think ecumenical activity is a fantastic endeavor, and where we can do that within church. I'm speaking with a church hat on that. But I would also want to reiterate that I don't think that necessarily a model of dwindling down to one kind of uniform training across all denominations is necessarily the best thing. I don't even know that it's always the best thing within a single denomination. In fact, you can look at other places and denominations, for instance, in America, that the reduction of training down to a singular model and a singular curriculum is not necessarily always the best thing. And I think that's one of the strengths of SEI being part of that Durham Confederation, is that there's diversity across that confederation, and they work alongside each other. So diversity in theological education, I think, is also important, but the ecumenical is too.
Thank you. Lisa, could I ask you to put your question, please?
Yes, so Anne spoke about interdisciplinarity, and so I've got a question on that line for Scott, which is, I wondered what interest you had from other faculties within Glasgow University in partnerships, because I'm just thinking of the range of Christian engagement around issues like climate change, poverty, and so on, and thinking that even medicine, different faculties, do they show any interest in partnering with theology?
They absolutely do, and there are active professing Christians across the university who have an interest in what's happening in theology and religious studies. But what I would say is interdisciplinarity is inherent in degrees at Glasgow, because even if you're doing the BD, you're required to do courses outside of theology and religious studies, whether that's history, whether that's education, and that's all fantastic. Where we're looking at doing much more intentional collaboration is we're rolling out a new master's degree in religion and global challenges. We'll draw on Alison Phipps from education, who will be talking about the refugee crisis and how religion plays into that. We're really fortunate to have on staff at the moment Mary McAleese, former president of Ireland, who will be talking about religion and international law, particularly in relation to the rights of the child. We'll have a number of members of the Iona community contributing in discourses around religion and climate change. It's slightly easier to do beyond the undergraduate level, but also in terms of the courses that we're rolling out, we plan to deliver in the next semester a course on religion and climate change in one of our short courses, and not directed at any one denomination, but a space where people from across religious traditions can come and think about that within that course. So we've been really fortunate. We've made an appointment of a colleague named Mark Johnston, who's come from Knox College in New Zealand and has a great deal of expertise in developing externally focused teaching. We really want to be able to teach and enhance beyond just our fixed student body. So there are opportunities there, but we're carving them out gradually.
Thanks very much. Before we've got one more question I see coming, but I would like to put a question to both of you, really coming from Anne's point about looking for higher degrees as a possibility in the SEI, and speaking as a kind of unregenerate old sort of academic. You know, what about the sort of the old-fashioned, a PhD in early Christian theology or medieval scholasticism or something, which doesn't really kind of, as it were, immediately have bearing upon, as it were, the practicalities, or maybe not, of the life of the church or contemporary Scotland. What about the sort of the old-fashioned, purely academic stuff? And is there still room for that in theology?
I'm going to be very naughty here, but I'm looking at the screen and I can see two fellow members of staff, and I can see our Director of Studies. Michael, your camera switched off, but I think you're still there. Would you like to answer that one? Because this is very much your area of encouragement.
I think it would be wonderful. I mean, my own feeling is that, as Anne indicated, academic theology, if you will, does underpin everything we're doing. And as Scott pointed out, when we see some theological illiteracy, if you will, both in the church and in the academy in terms of those who study for ministry, we need academic theologians. We're in desperate need of them. So I'd be, 200% behind training, particularly members of the clergy, to postgraduate level, particularly doctoral level, in so-called academic theology. Is that helpful?
Okay. Thank you. Scott, have you got any very briefly?
Well, I mean, I'm only speaking from an institutional perspective. We have 67 doctoral students at the moment. And I think overwhelmingly those are people that are well, let's say it's probably 50-50. There are people that are entering into that thinking, yeah, I want to go into an academic career. But I think the majority are doing it because they're interested, they're committed to their churches, and they see that this is a way that they can develop what they're doing. So just one more sidebar on that, David. We also, because of the hard work that you put in, we accredit the degrees at Edinburgh Theological Seminary as well, which is the College of the Free Church of Scotland, and we support their candidates through getting a Glasgow degree, although they deliver the teaching. But increasingly, we are getting master's level students and PhD students coming through ETS. So I think there's a recognition across denominations that the days of academic theology are needed now, if maybe not more than ever.
Thank you. Jem Scott, you had a question, I think, a little earlier. Can I invite you to...
Well, it's partly a question, but it's also I suppose a thank you and a tribute to both Anne and Scott, because as principal of the Scottish United Reformed and Congregational College, I gather students each week who are participating in both programs, and it is it is wonderful to see the contrasts and the commonalities between the two. I suppose going forward, the one thing that strikes me as an issue is the whole question of credit transfer, and also credit transfer mode of delivery, and also the possibility of having things in bite sizes. Now, I know that that doesn't address the issue of higher level scholarship, but for people coming in, particularly in the United Reformed Church, where we are beginning an ordained local ministry track, where everyone will have their own personalized and individualized training program. What's really helpful for me as a close partner of both institutions is to have those bite-sized 10-credit qualifications from which we can assemble programs, breaking it down. Now, that isn't to say that there doesn't have to be, obviously, structure, but the denominations can give structure if the institutions can give credits in bite sizes. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's if you like the challenge that I think I'm facing as a denominational consumer / provider.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anne, would you like to comment on that? And then Scott? Mm-hmm.
Also, having it in those sizes makes it easier, as we're trying to do now, to cascade some of what we teach internally, externally across the province, because people are happy to meet for, say, 5 Wednesday evenings in Lent or whatever, and do something of that size and that nature, who wouldn't commit to a whole semester or whatever it might be. So there's greater transferability if we have credit modules of that size. I would agree.
And Scott?
And when I say quickly, I do mean quickly this time. We've taken that into account in our development of these short courses, so they can be taken for 10 credits at university level or not, which means you don't have to do any assessments, and then they can be used towards the completion of credits at an undergraduate degree if somebody wanted to do that. So we're trying to work in ways that are enhancing for wider partnerships.
Thank you. Harriet, you've got a long question there, or would you like to say something to that you've written to everybody?
It's actually Lee's question, so I'll hand over to him.
I beg it does say Lee. I just see, yeah, Lee.
Sure. Yeah, I wondered from both your talks, actually, there was a lot of significant overlap and quite large remits. Especially in Anne's talk, I think a lot was said about forming people in Christ-likeness, forming people with Christian wisdom applied to everyday living, which part of which I know would be almost exclusively focused on ministerial life, but not all of it. And so therefore, part of it is actually forming people as Christians, which to me is the role of the local church primarily. And so that's one kind of overlap. The other overlap was, I think, Anne, you'd said about the kind of disinterested student experience of theology. And I think what Scott described is anything but that, in terms of, I do wonder if even at the university level there is such a thing as a disinterested student of theology, and it is actually always in some way formational for lay persons or those trained for ministry. So I'll just say that there's a lot of significant overlaps and perhaps differences that don't really exist. And I suppose where it leaves us is, with the lack of catechism in the local church and both of these institutions filling in for the local church in a certain sense in terms of theology, where is theology then in the local church?
Could I be collaborative again and call on a second member of staff from SEI, Richard, to talk a little bit about intentional discipleship, because I think that's part of what you're talking about, Lee, there in the first part of your question. And that's very much happening at local level, isn't it, Richard?
I think it would be fair to say that there is an aspiration that it would happen at a local level to an increased degree. I think perhaps the answer, Scott, I'm thinking about both currently and in the past, is that quite often local churches have not felt capable of doing what you're describing, particularly in terms of teaching of theology. I agree in terms of forming people of Christ-likeness and what have you. Yes, that perhaps probably would be seen more as the local church's remit. But I think there is a great challenge there. I think how much do people want to be formed? In a consumer culture. Some churches are doing extremely well by being very challenging in their discipleship standards. Others are a mile away from it. I think in both the things you described, there's an awful lot of work to be done in the local church context, and I don't know whether the theological institutions that exist, whether in university or independently, can be the answer to it all. I think there's an awful lot of work there. I almost want to turn the question back to you, Lee, and say, if we as SEI and or as Glasgow University are stepping into this gap, why is there such a gap?
Yeah.
Scott?
I think that gap has been a long process of relational attrition. And I mean, what I would want to emphasize, I think, is the need for collaboration across different institutions with different remits, but with shared purposes. It's a lot of what's happening at Glasgow is down to individuals' activities, but it's about reminding the university of their vocational responsibilities in terms of teaching and training, and then finding ways that we can facilitate that for partners. The relationship with the Iona community, I think, will be a reciprocal relationship, because they will provide opportunities that our students, we could never provide within the institution. But for them, it's important for them to think about where the next generation of the Iona community is going to come from. And so we want to actively support, not necessarily taking the place of the local church in terms of spiritual Christ-like formation, but creating a space where Iona-style worship can happen on a regular basis on campus. And introduce people to what the Iona community does, introduce young people to that. So, I mean, I think there's a real danger that what is created is competition between institutions, and not even necessarily speaking to SEI, but among the faculties and Scottish universities. But really, I think universities need to be much more proactive in reaching out to churches and saying, what can we do for you? And I think churches need to be less concerned or less anxious about turning to university partners and saying, these are the skills that we don't have or that we'd like to develop, and how can you help us do that? That's, I think, a return to what the institutions had done for centuries, and have, in some sense, forgotten how to communicate with one another.
Scott, could I just be a sort of devil's advocate in responding to that, really, and place that in the context of your initial remark about the kind of the waning, and some would say even more than that, the crisis of theology and religious studies in universities, where certainly in the UK now, faculties have closed, departments have got much smaller in places like Birmingham and Nottingham. And many people would see this as a real kind of crisis, not just simply a waning. So we've I've certainly felt this evening very much a kind of energy from both Anne and yourself. But is this as a kind of almost kind of last desperate cry of a dying animal that you're looking for relevance? Because why is theology dying out in the secular university? There must be a reason for that. And could you just comment on that?
So there's definitely an intersectional answer here, but I think the precursor to that death would, I think, be the waning of faith communities. I don't think theology departments are dwindling any faster than congregations or bums in seats, and I think that's in part, it's secularization, but it's also, I think, the failure in over decades for theology faculties to engage actively with churches, to help churches be live and vibrant and be able to provide education across generations. And in turn, so is there an economic model here? Probably. Is that the principal reason for wanting to partner? No, but it's certainly within that wider dynamic. But I think church is supporting the teaching of theology in universities enhances the life of the church and the church's ability to be missional and grow. So look, I don't want to put it in economic terms, because that's not what it's about, but it is, I think the interrelationship and collegiality between academy and church, is it a symptom of secularization, or is it one of the causes of secularization? You know, I think that there's an interrelationship between the two. If people aren't interested through the age of 0 to 18 in theology, then why would they study theology? And if universities aren't teaching theology to people that want to learn about theology, the people who are still members of churches, then what is it that we're trying to do educationally? So I think, you know, you're going to see an increasing focus at Glasgow in terms of providing theological education for non-degree students and for those who have degrees but want to continue to learn and continue to develop. So, I mean, that's why I was saying, I think what we're really kind of trying to aspire to is a cradle to grave model of provision of theological training. So,
thank you. Anne, do you have any further comment on that?
No, not on that, no.
Okay. We're getting a little towards the end of time, but we have time for another, maybe couple of questions. Anthea, I think I can see your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very interested in the engaging of members of churches, because in my diocese, I work with the priests on one subject, and then I work also with the MAP process when it gets going again. And I'm just amazed how difficult it is in almost every church I go to get this interest and excitement going in church members. And I've been a member of 2 Episcopal churches, and it's been the same, in more or less the same in both. And I also am a member of one of the committees in Edinburgh, which everybody thinks is really funny. I don't understand that either. But I'm trying, for example, I'm going to give an example, trying to get the whole committee to have an appreciation that child poverty isn't all about money, because that's the sort of thing you could engage members of the churches to do, to think of stuff that would be good to bring parents and grannies and children in for joyful activities rather than for being taught about something. And in this, I just want Scott to know that in this big committee, there are 2 members of the URC church that are on this committee, and they're the only 2 that really speak my language. And so I think it's great that we are now getting together with other people that are excited about stuff. And I think it is a hard job, but we really need to know how we could do this in the best way.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any comment? You're muted.
I'm unmuted now, yes. No, I mean, I was just thinking as Anthea was speaking of my own experience of, I suppose it's more than 40 years ago, working in a base community in South America, where the doing theology came naturally in base communities, in small communities, because it was from the grassroots, arising from the practical experience of life at the margins, and it was that bottom-up catalyst that created huge theological engagement, discussion, and excitement within ordinary congregations. And I'm just wondering if in a sense, COVID or other issues such as you speak of are going to be similar catalysts for congregations in Scotland today. That would be my hope and prayer, in fact. That's my answer to that one.
Thank you. We've got 2 questions, which I'd like, both of them are very interesting. So if I could ask you to be brief, but nevertheless, Jerry Dillon, would you like to put your question?
Thank you. It was just a question about attracting people to to the universities to study theology, and also as a way of bringing people more to the ordained ministry. And so what about the role of chaplains, and what about the role of schools, especially not theology, but RE departments?
Scott?
Great question. So, I mean, the first response I would make, I guess, is actually how often do chaplains really get into schools to do anything anymore in a proactive and engaged way? I mean, I know that they come in and they do assemblies and other things, but I'm not sure that churches, in some sense, have the same credibility and relationship with head teachers and to be as active as they would have been in the past. Secondly, religious and moral education is a fundamental requirement in terms of secondary education. But what's really interesting is we see in terms of university admissions, those students come out and then they go and take philosophy because they think the natural pathway to those questions that are being asked is philosophy. They take a first-year philosophy course, found out that philosophy is not at all what they were expecting, and probably would have been better off studying theology and religious studies in terms of the interest and the nature of the question. So I think there's a responsibility for universities. Actually, I was in a meeting the other day with all the heads of subjects from across the university that we need to be clear on this. But students come out of secondary school, you know, with an interest. They've been exposed to religion, even if it's not been in a church. So I think thinking about the ways that we make connections or at least latch on to opportunities that are there is a really important question.
Thank you. And Andrew Parfit, please. You've got a question, which I think must be the last one.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering about how, be it church or academy, we can support the highly informal study of theology. You know, in an era of things like YouTube, iTunes, you know, you can take catechism, not courses in terms there's no coursework, but you can watch a series of videos on catechism. And how can we be involved in doing that and steering people who are interested at that kind of beginner stage of theology and doctrine towards quality sources and away from less quality sources?
And do you have a comment on that? I mean, I think, you know, we're all learning new ways of necessity at the moment. As you know, I struggled a bit when I started teaching with Big Blue Button, but I came to, even dare I say it, quite like it. But,
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Anyway, I mean, I think one of the ways, that's not quite the question.
Well, but from our perspective, one of the ways we're doing it is by teaching those that we're responsible for how to moderate between the good, bad, and the indifferent, and how to be selective, so that they then go on, because remember that everybody we teach is meant to be a catalyst, is to run back from the well and spread that with the communities that they then work with. So we have a training of the trainers responsibility in that sense. So that those who are going to be the theological educators within congregations know how to discriminate well. And of course, laterally, we've been having to use more things online and do flipped classroom teaching, etc. So we ourselves are learning about quality control as we're actually teaching and using these materials. So it's a really good question, Andrew. Thank you.
Could Scott?
Yeah, I think I'm actually unmuted. I'm unmuted.
Yeah,
Right?
you're fine.
I mean,
You're fine.
That's a great question. And what Anna's saying about preparing people to vet sources is really, really important. I think from the perspective of people delivering education, I think there's been a lot of anxiety around the need or a perceived need for it to be polished, for it to be high production value. I'm actually part of a group at Glasgow that's actively lobbying the university to make level 1 teaching that we're doing this year open access for everybody next year. So, you know, we're recording all these lectures level 1, and I'm not saying just for theology, but if, you know, a level 1 course on economics is not overly proprietary, right? I mean, it's going to be the same as many other places. Why not put that material online for free so that if somebody wants to learn a bit more about economics, it doesn't need to be high profile. If anybody's seen Yale open courses, Yale offers full courses online for free. You can do a great course on New Testament texts online. You watch the videos at your own pace. They give you a list of the reading, and they're just recorded lectures. I mean, I think actually it's about being more proactive to get good material out there and less anxious about the production value. And just one more point on that. We did a couple of seminars over the summer that were run in some sense as a test to see if the technology would work for the short courses we're going to do. We did an hour-and-a-half event on theology in the age of COVID. We had 250 people tune into that from about 5 continents, and it was low production value. But you know, I think even as tonight indicates, if you can do things in a format like this, you save a half an hour on the travel to the place, you save a half an hour on the travel back. Ideally, what we're going to be doing at Glasgow, we're diversifying our seminars to be more subject specific, and we're doing all of them with at least one international partner. And what will happen is colleagues at Lund or colleagues at Stellenbosch will meet in one room, Glasgow staff and students will meet in one room, and anybody else out there who wants to connect from their living room will be able to do that. So I think it's about finding ways to open up the conduits of what we're doing already for people who are interested, and just make it easier for people.
Thank you very much. We've kind of run out of time, but Anne, do you have any final comments? You may not, but
no, it's just been wonderful to be part of this, and yeah, thank you, David, for the opportunity to dialogue with Scott.
Well, could I thank both of you, both Anne and Scott, very much, and also for everybody who participated. I think this has been a really interesting and diverse discussion. It's opened up lots of interesting avenues of thought for both theology and also for the church and ministry and training of the ministry. So I'm grateful to everybody who's come, but especially to our two speakers for this evening. Normally we would have had a little hospitality after this, but that's one of the downsides of being virtual, that may have to wait till a little bit later, and hopefully life becomes a bit more normal.